Epictetus says Diogenes was free. How did he come by this? Not because he was of free parents, he was not, but because he was free himself and had cast away all the weakness that might give slavery a hold on him. And so no one could approach or lay hold on him to enslave him.
Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Diogenes, the Cynic philosopher. So, going to make a tour into a different philosophy, but one that had a lot of impact on the Stoics, especially on Epictetus.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about. I mean, we've done some episodes talking about different philosophers and their philosophy. I wanted to do this one on Diogenes because, as you said, he's such an inspiration to Stoicism. I mean, there's a direct lineage we'll get into of Stoicism from Cynicism and from Diogenes, and he's also just an interesting character. Did a lot of eccentric thing, very famous for his kind of shocking approach to life, and so he is an interesting person to test maybe your philosophical intuitions or your philosophical positions against. When I think of cynicism, it's almost like Stoicism gone a step further, and it's like Stoicism too far. And Stoicism is too far for most people, or very far already for most people. And so it's interesting to see, well, what happens when we push it further. Which of those parts are we okay with, and which of those parts do we think are too much? And we'll get a feel for that as we go over the life and stories of Diogenes today.
Like one common way to set up Stoicism is that it falls in between Aristotelianism and Cynicism. So for the Aristotelian, in order to live well, you need both the external and the internal to go right for you. You know, you need to be virtuous, but also perhaps have some level of wealth, health, and reputation. And then for the cynic, it's just the internal. It's just that internal sense of freedom or virtue that matters. Whereas the Stoics carve a middle path of sorts. They say, you know, virtue is enough, but they also say leave open this category for the preferred indifference. You know, all things considered, things like wealth, health are preferable. They are, in a sense, have value, even if they're not necessary for happiness. So that's, I think, is one way to explain why you say the cynics are that next level of stoicism, because they just focus on virtue and I think explicitly despise things like wealth and reputation.
Yeah.
They don't say they're
The,
good
ex-
at all.
the example I was thinking of when you were saying that is the Aristotelian maybe thinks you need a comfy bed to be happy. The Stoics think you don't need a comfy bed, but you're not going to say no. You know, if somebody offers it to you, yeah, I'll sleep in that comfy bed. And then the cynic is going to reject the comfy bed. He's going to say, spit in the face of the person who offered it to them, maybe, and say, you've got this all wrong. You've confused me as for somebody, weak or somebody else. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but that kind of that three approaches to external goods, I think you described really well.
Cool. So do you want to hop into some anecdotes or
Yeah,
give
well,
some
I'll
more
start.
structure to
Yeah,
Diogenes or
I'm going to start with an introduction to his life for those who aren't familiar, who are
okay.
listening. Talk a bit about his background. A lot of the sources I'm getting here are from a different Diogenes, Diogenes Laertius. He wrote the lives of eminent philosophers. So I think he's around, off the top of my head, he was around maybe the 2nd century AD. So he would have been living quite a bit in the future to the Diogenes the Cynic, but he kind of compiled the biographies and writings and anecdotes of a lot of famous philosophers. A lot of what we know about the ancient Stoics, not Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Seneca, but the ones that came before them, like Zeno and Cleanthes, we also know
Mhm.
from this book, The Lives of Eminent Philosophers. So a lot of what we'll be pulling on today comes from that. So a bit about Diogenes and his life, and how he became the cynic he was. So he was born between 412 and 404 BC in Sinope, which is a Greek colony on the northern coast of modern day Turkey. At a young age, he was captured by pirates and sold into slavery. And that's actually something I didn't realize until doing the research for this episode, is that connection with slavery. Um, as we'll get to, he was very influential thinker for Epictetus, and there's that immediate connection there about having also lived as a slave. At some
Yeah, yeah, that's
point,
right.
yeah, at some point he gained his freedom from slavery and reached Athens. And as a free man there, he learned philosophy from Antisthenes, which was a student of Socrates who was present at Socrates' execution in Athens. So we have a lineage there from Socrates to Antisthenes to Diogenes the Cynic. He's reported to have said that he earned his real freedom from Antisthenes in the form of an education, and that after learning philosophy, he could never be enslaved again. So there's that theme there of, that you see, that's something we see in Epictetus a lot, which is that, freedom is knowledge or virtue or something that's gained internally from a kind of internal mastery. And then once you have philosophy is the root to that freedom, and once you have that, you can't be enslaved or made unfree, even if you're, literally sold into slavery by pirates. Um, I would say Diogenes inherited two parts of Socrates' legacy from Antisthenes. So, like Socrates, he became a philosophical gadfly, irritating those around him, pushing people to question their beliefs or what they took for granted, their assumptions. And second, and maybe even more than Socrates, Diogenes didn't care about what people thought or about the reputation of others. He pursued the truth, and we'll discuss this as we get to the anecdotes, whether or not he did that in a way that was actually helpful, or was more abrasive than it needed to be. He was certainly pursuing the truth at the expense or without considering how this made him look or his kind of social status. As a philosopher, he dedicated his life to pulling people out of complacency and getting them to question their assumptions, like I was saying. And he did this a lot by doing shocking things in public. So he was known to urinate, defecate, even masturbate in public. He would sleep in Athens in the streets in a barrel. He would point at things with his middle finger, which was offensive at the time, like it is today. And he would accost Athenians. And this way of living, it earned him the reputation for being like a dog. He was dirty, slept outside, and the word cynic, it derives from the Greek word for dog. And so whenever you hear, Diogenes the Cynic, this is what people are calling. They're calling him Diogenes the dog, and or the one who's like a dog, and that's what the cynics take up. They take up it's that kind of that twist where they actually take it up as a sign of pride, right? Instead of rejecting it, instead of taking it as a criticism, they go, yeah, I'm gonna meet your insult and actually incorporate it and take it on as kind of our calling card now. And in terms of Stoicism, this is what I've described is a lot further than what we talk about in this podcast or what Stoicism would advocate for. Stoicism is not asking us to urinate or defecate in public. It's not asking us to flip people off. Um, especially that's just not something that Stoicism is more pro-social. It's more about doing well with others than Cynicism is. But Stoicism is a direct intellectual descendant of Cynicism. So Diogenes the Cynic's main pupil was Crates of Thebes. And Crates was the philosophical teacher of Zeno of Citium when he first arrived in Athens. And Zeno is the original founder of Stoicism. So you have, Socrates' student, Diogenes, then Diogenes' student, and then Zeno. So there's that direct family tree or lineage. So Stoicism as a tradition, it's just two steps removed from Diogenes. And we see that lineage carried more or less, depending on the philosopher. We already mentioned Epictetus, but Diogenes is the second most cited philosopher by Epictetus after only Socrates. So in Epictetus' discourses, Diogenes is the person he mentions the most other than Socrates. So that inspiration is felt, even though there was a break between Cynicism and Stoicism, that inspiration was still felt. And you get in Epictetus these explicit, glorification of cynicism, where Epictetus says cynicism is actually a higher calling than Stoicism because it's a great life, but not a life everybody's cut out for. Everybody can be a Stoic, says Epictetus, but not everybody can be a cynic, because to be a cynic I requires a kind of resiliency from these external goods, a total willingness to forego even preferred indifference in this extreme pursuit of truth and virtue. And one thing that Epictetus does to point to the cynics, he says they're almost like, well, I think the metaphor he uses exactly is that they're kind of like scouts in a war. They go out ahead, they put themselves at risk, they put themselves in danger,
Hmm.
but they return to the base with information, right? So the cynic, sleeps in a barrel and then he returns and says, I slept in a barrel and I was still happy. It turns out you don't need a comfy bed to be happy. And they're kind of returning that information to the general population. They're bringing these examples back. And so Epictetus, um, praises them or salutes them for going out and doing the kind of harder job, being at the front lines of this experience and bringing that information back to the rest of us. So that's a bit of background on Diogenes. He's famous for these really funny stories. But anything you want to say on his background or connection to Stoicism before we dig into these?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to call out that connection between Epictetus and Diogenes. They both experienced slavery, and to think of it, they both have a philosophical emphasis on freedom. I think it's slightly different in both cases, but it does seem like a core part of Diogenes' Cynic philosophy is that it's a way to be free by practicing philosophy, and free in a sense that really matters. That's in a sense more fundamental than one's political or economic situation. And of course, there's Epictetus, and he's constantly accusing his students of acting like slaves to their desires. He is the great example of the successful Roman who's a slave to one of their mistresses and so on. Um, and also puts forth that positive vision of what it is to be free, to live in accordance with nature. So I think that is, I think we'll keep on talking about some of the differences and similarities, but that is a key, both biographical similarity and ethical similarity between the two philosophies, as this emphasis on freedom and making it more of an internal rather than external
Mm-hmm.
matter.
I mean, I think you nailed that at the end. That's the shift. Is turning, is taking slave and being free or being a slave and making it something internal. It's something you gain through the study of philosophy. It's not something you gain from money or even from, you know, literally ending your slavery in a kind of a relationship sense. Nor is it something you lose if you become a slave, right? You still keep your freedom as long as you've achieved this internal state. And yet both of
Mhm.
them, it, I always feel a bit silly saying that kind of stuff, but it hits with a bit more pizzazz coming from people who experienced it firsthand, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. In a sense, both the two of them earned the right to make claims like that.
Yeah.
Or one other thing I wanted to mention is that Diogenes is a he inherited two parts of Socrates' legacy. First, and we'll talk about this, especially comes out in stories of his life. He's a gadfly, forcing others to think about their own life differently, being obnoxious, and so on. And then a second, I think, and that's related to this, is that he doesn't care about his reputation, like Socrates, perhaps doesn't care about reputation for his own sake. And I think you can also extend that to some of the other classic externals the Stoics talk about. Wealth, pleasure are things he positively despised, um, and that's another way in which the philosophy is more intense than Stoicism.
Yeah, there's this kind of. I mean, I was just at a wedding last weekend, and we got talking to what we do, and I talked about Stoicism, and there's this kind of visceral reaction people have to Stoicism, especially if they've heard a little bit about it, but they don't practice it. And sometimes, Caleb, when we're hosting this podcast and we're talking to each other, we're in so deep we don't realize. I often forget that there's something radical about Stoicism, right? We were laughing at the wedding about think every like memento mori, just think about the fact that you're going to die, and they were laughing about how intense and ridiculous that position is. Um, or not ridiculous, but how strange it is, and it can make people uncomfortable. Um, and so you forget how radical Stoicism is. Stoicism is radical, but it's often radical, um, I guess maybe in a less active way. It's about, you're kind of leading by example. Like Epictetus says again, don't
Mhm.
tell people about your philosophy. If you're at a dinner or a party, just act the way you're supposed to act. And that will kind of inspire people or confuse people. Why aren't you getting upset about this? Why aren't you worried about this? Why aren't you feeling angry like everybody else is angry? You'll show it in your example in Stoicism, but there's something proactive about cynicism and Socrates' approach that I think is the difference. It's both more extreme and then also more intense. One of Epictetus, I keep going back to Epictetus here just because he's so connected to Diogenes, but one of Epictetus's points is that a Stoic should not convert. Stoics should not go out and try to teach non-Stoics. His point, speaking from whether we agree or not, his point for speaking from experience, which is that it's not effective. And I think the Socratic and the Cynic difference is to disagree with that, or at least think that we have
Mhm.
more of a role in actually forcing these philosophies in people's faces.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think I mean, you see in Seneca as well the line of thought where it's you're supposed to live in the city, but not be of the city in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You play your role while avoiding some of the risks or vices that perhaps and is involved in living life with others, and try to carve out that middle path. Whereas Diogenes is living on the outskirts of
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps that's a place where a classic objection to Stoicism is that it's not revolutionary enough or agrees too much with the status quo. Um, and perhaps you get that to some extent because Stoics live within the system, see what they can do from within the system. I think there's some historical counterexamples to that, but at least that's a common strategy for Stoics and a common objection that people have to different Stoics. But the perhaps one benefit of cynicism, one potential positive upshot of it, is that you have the chance for more moral revolutions or moral insight, as it were, from coming from the outside. And just to connect this sort of longer thought, I suppose, is that the Stoics got a lot of their ideas about cosmopolitanism from the Cynics. So perhaps that's an example of a kind of moral insight or moral view
Mm-hmm.
that's novel, that the Stoics managed to adapt from these people who lived on the outskirts of the city.
Yeah, well, I was in my research for that was something I learned in the research for this episode as well, where the Diogenes the Cynic was actually the first person to use the word cosmopolitan because he was asked, where are you from, and he said, well, I'm a citizen of the cosmos, right? My polis is the cosmos, and so he was the one that introduced that idea, the first person to do that, at least the first recorded person. So it's a great point. That's a moral insight that the Stoics have taken from the Cynics.
Yeah, and maybe that's one that's easier to see in Diogenes' position and harder to get if you're the typical Athenian or
Yeah.
typical Spartan or what have you.
Cool. So let's go through some of these anecdotes or just like kind of stories from Diogenes' life, which will show what he got up to. And I figure I'll read a story and then we'll unpack it a bit. I think some of these are quite funny, and they're some of my favorite parts. So first one is called "Looking for an Honest Man." So once Diogenes was walking through his city in broad daylight with his lamp lit. When people asked him what he was doing, he said he was searching for an honest man. When one young man blushed, Diogenes responded that this was the complexion of virtue. So we were just giving this example of being upfront and accosting people with your philosophy versus being more passive. And so this is an example of he's walking around in the daylight, holding a lamp, being like, I'm looking for like an honest person. I'm looking for a good person. And then the second part to that is that a young man blushes, which means he's kind of embarrassed. The young man actually kind of gets Diogenes' point, which is like, You're all not as good of people as you claim to be. And then Diogenes says, "Oh, there, that is the complexion of virtue," which is to say, um, you know, maybe you're not honest, but at least you acknowledge that you're not honest, and you feel a bit of shame and embarrassment when I do this little stunt, and that's a good thing. That kind of means you're on the right track.
Well, I like that idea. Error is recognizing error is the beginning of wisdom. I think Diogenes recognizes perhaps at least that's that response to blush or whatever Diogenes said is at least the beginning of virtue. I think that's true in a generally useful principle. I think.
And again, just very abrasive here, going out and just accusing people of being dishonest. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
cool. So next one is called, well, I've called it "Behold a Man." So once Plato at his academy, so Diogenes lived at the same time as Plato, and they were always kind of getting into, always kind of bickering with each other in Athens. So once Plato at his academy was working with other people at the academy to provide a succinct definition of what a human is. They came up with the definition of a bipedal, hairless animal. Diogenes, hearing this, stripped a chicken of its feathers, carried it into the academy, and proclaimed, "Behold, a man, since a chicken walks on two legs and has no hair." I mean, this one's for me is it is a radical pushback against even we admire these thinkers. Think about the pedestal we put Plato on. Think about the pedestal we put Aristotle on, or even Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. And it's just a kind of slap in the face of that. It's just like, hey, these smart people, they can say stupid things. And I think also there's a second point, which is like, in your attempt to explain the world, you're actually making yourself dumber. You're actually becoming ignorant because you're oversimplifying something. You're like, okay, we've defined a human, we've closed the case on what a human is, but it's not a correct definition. And if we jump too quickly to these kind of, I guess, these dogmatic positions, we can miss the truth of the matter. That's what I take from this one.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a good example of Diogenes. So often he comes after maybe the previous story he came after the typical uh, Greek, whereas here he's also targeting one of the idols of philosophers, right, Plato, and doing it in really a humiliating fashion. He didn't just mention the counterexample; he made it apparent. So I guess that's another thought that where I think it's related to the methodology of the Cynics, where often instead of working through argument like the Platonists or indeed the Stoics, it's much more a matter of almost rhetoric or showing what's true, what's possible, being abrasive. In this case, showing a clear, concrete counterexample, but in other cases, maybe using more tools of wit or straightforward conflict to get at some insight.
Yeah, I never thought of that before, but I mean, that's the same example with the lamp in the daylight, right? Like,
Mhm.
he could just be running around the street and being like, "You're all not honest," "You're all fake." But instead, he makes a kind of spectacle of it, so it sticks with people more. Same thing with the chicken, right? These are spectacles. It's a funny point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're kind of spectacle, a kind of recognition of perhaps fact that humans don't always work through argument, through dialogue. And I think you said your second point for this story was that rather than trying to explain what a human is, come up with a definition, you're compressing reality too much. Maybe this is reading too much into the Cynics, but I think in a way they're not very systematic philosophers. And perhaps part of that, if you wanted to give a defense of that approach, is that systematicity often obscures reality or is too abstract, too simple, and it's perhaps better to focus on the concrete, what's in front of you. Tools like wit, humor, those are just as important in your philosophical toolkit as uh, knowing how to construct and evaluate a proper syllogism.
Yeah. It also, I mean, that's a good point. It also makes me think of how one of Socrates' strategies, and we talked about this in our episode on the Socratic method, is you get the person participating. And so that's why Socrates asks questions, because once you start asking people questions, you get them participating in their own philosophical education. You pull out their assumptions, you pull out their intuitions. And so by using wit, rhetoric, this kind of spectacle, you're pulling people into the discussion much more than if you were to just provide a couple premises on why um, a bipedal hairless animal is not
Yeah, yeah,
an exclusive definition of a human. So you pull people into the to participating, and that I think is the biggest problem with well, one of the biggest problems would be disinterest, right? More than anything than the skill or quality of your arguments. If the person isn't interested, you're not going to teach them anything.
yeah. Nice. You want to go to the next one?
Yeah. So this next one is a cup. So Diogenes walks to a river with his one possession, a small cup for drinking water. As he is filling the cup for a drink from the river, he sees a small boy drinking from the same stream, except the boy is drinking from his hands, putting them together to form a small cup. Diogenes is outraged. He exclaims, "A child has beat me in the plainness of living." And so, I mean, this is a funny one to contrast with the Plato example, because in the previous you think, wow, this guy's got a big head. Geez, he's pretty cocky, going in there, going into Plato's academy and calling Plato dumb. But at the same time, he's willing to learn from somebody, from a child, um, and that I think speaks to the humility there. It speaks to a even though he's extreme, he's not on a high horse. He's genuinely trying to learn and genuinely seeing where he can learn and taking that from anywhere, even if that's something that a child is doing well, which is, drinking without a cup, showing that another possession is not actually necessary for living well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you also see, of course, there's the theme of not needing external things and reducing the value of utensils, clothing, to say nothing of wealth in general.
I need my
Um,
utensils. Yeah.
yeah, I need my
Take
utensils.
everything else, but leave my utensils, please.
Yeah, so that's another key theme. I think a Stoic pushback would be, well, you often need things like cups, utensils to live well, to be a good host, to save time for your other adventures, whatever it is.
Well,
Um,
I think the Stoic claim there would also be that there's no harm in a cup of water as long as
yeah,
it's well used, right? Like that's the idea of the indifferent. It's good or bad depending on how you use it. And if you're avoiding cups because you think they're going to corrupt you, well, a cup can't corrupt a good person. It's just the thing you use to drink water, right? A bed doesn't corrupt a good person. It's just a place to sleep. And so thinking of indifference as being not necessary for a good life, but also not corrupting, really indifferent is the Stoic position. So throwing away a cup is stupid, basically.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Whereas I think there's the Cynic view. It always seems like there's something negative about having material goods.
Hmm.
Either they are corrupting, or there's something intrinsically valuable about not needing them, about this kind of pure independence, um, that's internal, but also in some ways external. Concerns your body. You don't need. Uh, it's good to have your body survive on as little as possible, as little fancy food, uh, as little shelter, and so on. There's almost something intrinsically appealing about that for cynics. It sometimes seems from these stories.
Yeah, I agree. I think I aspire to the humility he showed here. I aspire to be the kind of person who can just be disgusted with myself or angry when I see a child being
Yeah,
kind or moderate or minimalistic in a way that I can learn from. Like, I want to be the kind of person that can learn from everybody, even children, not just great philosophers. But I do disagree with the cynics here. I think it is silly to think you've made some sort of mistake having a cup of water by the river,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right.
So, next one, rapid fire. Next story is a master. So, very short one. When being sold at a slaver's market, so this is while he was still a slave, he is reported to have pointed at a man and said, "Sell me to this man. He looks like he needs a master." And that's just, again, just the wit we were talking about, the punchiness. And it's that distinction we talked about earlier about internal versus external. So there's obviously it's just ironic because it's the contrast. Externally, he's clearly a slave. This person is buying him. Internally, he's saying, "I'm a free man. You are a slave, and I could actually be a good master to you because you're a slave. You need a master." Talking about that, in making that internal external divide, which these aren't people sitting around debating. This is somebody at a slaver's market, like the kind of I don't know, the kind of radical perspective that would take to have that perspective in that moment is pretty shocking, pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think it's impressive. And there's also just, I think, recognizing that you don't need to play the social role that others have assigned to you. And there's something like a firmness of mind or character or something that, or a mark like that, shows. It reminds me a little bit about, there's a story about Julius Caesar being captured by pirates, and the pirates are going to put him up for a ransom, and he insists that the price is too low and that they ought to set a higher price. 20 talents is too little. It should be 50. Y'all are morons. The worst pirates I've ever encountered. Just not acting like someone who, is a hostage and now thinks that they need to do whatever it takes to survive, instead of, I think, Caesar has the attitude that he was Caesar before he was captured, and he's still Caesar when he was captured, right? And I think you see
Yeah.
that in Diogenes as well.
It's a very stoic position. I mean, the Caesar example is a great one. Very funny story. But it's about who you are is something you kind of carry around with you into every situation. It's something internal. It's about your character. And so you could literally be getting sold at a slaver's market. You could be captured by pirates. You are not now a slave internally. You don't, as you said, you don't have to take on this role that you've been given internally. You've been
Mhm.
captured by pirates. You don't now have to be pathetic, cowardly. You don't have to be the kind of things we might ascribe to. I mean, pathetic was probably harsh, but you don't have to take on the things that we think the way somebody captured in war has to act, right? It has to be defeated, I should say, instead of pathetic, but like, defeated, begging, things like this. And maybe that's actually the smart thing to do, is to pump up somebody's ego in that situation or something, but it's not a necessity, right?
Mhm.
You don't have to take on that role because you carry yourself into each situation independent of those external circumstances. It's a very stoic idea.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think there's also that idea, just as you said, that it's not necessary. It still
Mhm.
could be the strategic move. So even though Diogenes' story, Julius Caesar's story are inspiring, there are equally stories of people essentially acting recklessly, brash in such circumstances that don't turn out so well for them. So
Yeah.
I think that's another kind of, I think, Stoic qualification, perhaps.
I mean, if Caesar got executed there
Yeah,
because he was talking too much for a prisoner, it wouldn't be such a cool story, right? So the lesson kind of stands outside of that. There's a certain amount of pragmatics there too. So one last one, it kind of hits on the same ideas. So this last story, it's about Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world at the time, traveled to meet the famous Diogenes, he came upon Diogenes on a sunny day lying in the grass. As Alexander stood over him, he asked Diogenes if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes responded that Alexander could get out of his son. After this encounter, Alexander is reported to have said, "Had I not been Alexander, I should have liked to have been Diogenes." And I think that's the same. I think it's the same kind of story, right? Which is that who you are at your. So there's that idea of you don't need things. I'm not a slave to any of my desires. I'm not asking Alexander to give me uh, money or give me power or give me a political position just because he respects me. There's that kind of minimalism as well. There, you can see how Diogenes is putting his money where his mouth is, and he's not anybody's slave, even the most powerful man in the world. He's not slave to anybody else's power. But there's also that idea we just hit before where you carry who you are into every situation. So, just because Alexander the Great walks over doesn't mean you have to like sit up, doesn't mean you have to compliment him or bow or whatever people would typically do. You
Hmm.
can just continue to be yourself. There's no necessity because this person has this kind of social status to change. And, the kind of moral at the end there was that actual staying the same garnered respect instead of, instead of it being antagonistic, it was actually, oh, wow, this person is a peer or an equal. It's somebody who Alexander admired Diogenes for it. And I think that's something that I aspire to is to, I guess, retain my values and retain what's important to me, regardless of if, who's in the room or who I'm
Hmm.
hanging out with or who I'm talking to. Uh, it's not Alexander the Great, but it might be someone who has some power, somebody that could do me a favor, and to try to not fall victim of, I guess, being a sycophant, right? Or being a suck up in those kind of situations is something that I aspire to.
It's a great story, and I think you captured it, pull out some of the main threads really well. Probably my favorite story about Diogenes. And it is true that people who have a very high status, especially figures like Alexander or successful entrepreneurs, athletes, and so on, it is striking how if they enter a room, the character of everyone else often changes, and there's a kind of force to treat them in a specific way. If you've ever been in these situations, it's something viscerally changes about the energy, the social energy of these kinds of situations, and it can probably pull you into playing the role of the sycophant or something of that nature. So, this ability that Diogenes models, I think, is a good one to remember if you ever find yourself in these kinds of situations.
And I think I guess the most grounded example, because we're not all, I've never been in a room with Bill Gates or Barack Obama or anything like this. But, even just if your boss, you can even just feel that if your boss walks in a room at a normal job, the energy will change. And, one idea I've had with that something my dad used to say, which is to say, it's not a bad thing if your behavior changes when your boss walks in, but like make sure it's on purpose. Which is to say, don't kind of, we don't
Mhm.
want to be passively pulled into that energy. So, like if I'm going to strategically change my behavior, that's a strategic decision you can make, but be intentional about it. If you're going to be politically or socially savvy with someone with power, be intentional about it. Make sure it corresponds to the rest of your value. As you mentioned, that kind of energy, don't just get pulled into that energy because that's kind of the visceral way that humans work. You want to be resilient to that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule of thumb. That reminder of purpose, I think, is
Mhm.
an important one. I think without that, it's easy to get swept away by whatever the social situation is, the behavior of others.
And so those are the stories. I mean, there's more stories, but those were some of my favorites that I pulled out. And I think the reason I did this episode in stories, you already mentioned, Caleb, is that he's not a systematic thinker. He's not somebody who wrote down his thought step by step. These are the 10 steps to cynicism. He's somebody who kind of lived by example. Um, And I think if you're listening to this, try to take some of think about what those examples mean. Think about what those stories mean. They don't have to mean the same thing to you that they meant to us. They're maybe almost pieces of performance art in a way that can be, abrasive, shocking, and are meant to be evocative and make you think about, the way you relate to other people, possessions, power. And Diogenes just does a great job of that and walked the walk. To wrap things up, I'm gonna with these anecdotes in mind, and to wrap things up, I'm gonna go to a quote of what Epictetus said of Diogenes. So this is from his Discourses, book 4, chapter 1. Epictetus says Diogenes was free. How did he come by this? Not because he was of free parents, he was not, but because he was free himself and had cast away all the weakness that might give slavery a hold on him. And so no one could approach or lay hold on him to enslave him. Everything he had, he was ready to let go. It was loosely attached to him. If you had laid hold on his property, he would have let it go rather than have followed you for it. If you seized his leg, he would have let that go. If his whole poor body, he would have let his whole body go. And that shows how the notion of Diogenes, and I think Diogenes walked the walk in those uh, in those anecdotes, those stories of his life. And that's a tradition that flowed through to Epictetus. And Epictetus is pointing out, look, you gain freedom, real freedom, as an internal state by controlling your desires, minimizing your fears, or rather redirecting your desires and fears to only desire to be a good person and only being fearful of being a bad person. And when you do that, you have no weakness that other people can take advantage of. You have no, I guess, kind of lust or desire that other people can bribe. And so when people threaten you, you're ready to let it go. When people bribe you, you're ready to let that go as well. And that's how you gain freedom, not by having free parents coming from a certain kind of family. And that's, I think, a crucial Cynic idea that flows all the way through to Epictetus.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's well put. Um, and circles back to this idea of freedom and it being an internal matter. And Diogenes models that. We touched on one criticism of cynicism from the Stoic angle, which is, I think, what are you using this freedom for? And the Cynics model autonomy, independence as perhaps independent goods, whereas the Stoic would, I think, push for a larger set of virtues perhaps that are more social in nature, at least for the typical person. Maybe some people are called to be the gadfly on the outskirts. Diogenes still is a model. People like him with his temperament, perhaps ought to, live lives like that. But most people are not Diogenes and should not aspire to be like him. And as such, this kind of minimalist attitude, perhaps not so useful. The extreme minimalism, and perhaps not so useful. And perhaps they're not called to be as much of a gadfly or challenger to common social norms. So I think that's a kind of criticism the Stoics would make of the Cynic project of a whole, even while they allow us to learn a lot from the Cynics, and even more than that, believe that some people ought to be Cynics in a real sense.
Yeah, I mean, if we stick to the role example, right? It's like any sport. Not everybody wants to be the striker or the forward in soccer. But if everybody's the forward, you end up like the kids playing soccer. There's no goalie. There's no defenseman. So it's like you need people to play their role, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to be the same. Everybody can play the same role. That obviously doesn't work. So it's a way to say, yeah, it's a way to both say cynicism is useful. It's even proper for some people, but it's not for everybody. And statistically, it's really probably not for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have a favorite one of the anecdotes that we covered?
I also like the Alexander the Great one because I think it's so compelling to anybody. Um, I think I like I like the combination of the cup and the behold a man. Just that exact idea of I'm going to make fun of Plato and I'm also going to like learn from a child. And
Hmm.
that is not something that I think many people do. So that I'm kind of combining two
Yeah.
there. But I love that idea of, if I have well, I think we all haven't, maybe we don't all, maybe it's just me. But whenever you get role models, right? And you look up to people. And like, I look up to Epictetus in particular of the Stoics. That's my favorite Stoic. I look up to Marcus Aurelius and Seneca as well. And I'm not the kind of person who's like, finds it very easy to candidly be like, well, that was a stupid thing to say. Or, like that didn't make any sense. And I think that kind of like candid criticism, taking off that rose colored glasses around your intellectual role models is something really valuable. But then also being willing to learn both from Plato, but also from anybody who has good examples at the same time.
Yeah, true, true. Yeah, I think that's a good combination and a good place to end.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening all. Peace.